Paul's watching, he's like, "Wow, I'm so impressed right now."
Well, imagine if John Vervaeke is watching and he notices Lucas using the LLMs.
He will start
Then,
screaming.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we'll get doxxed.
Yeah.
That's what I think too.
Okay, so I started
Okay.
the stream. I think can some of you check, and then
Yeah.
make sure it's not
Is it like
echoing.
okay,
Uh,
yeah, it's up, available.
Is it up?
Like a slight delay, but
Yes, it is up. I think.
yeah, it's up.
We'll start
Oh,
screaming.
can you hear that?
Yeah, I could hear that.
I could hear that.
Sorry.
That was confusing because I turned off the audio on the one that I was watching, and I still heard something. Okay,
It's my bad.
no worries. So we're all good. Lucas, you want to start us off?
Sure. This is chapter 4. I'm excited to be here with Michael, Aaron, and special guest GP Xavier. GP, good to have you.
Thank you.
This chapter was called Fighting for Freedom. It speaks about, well, it's based on the Bible books, James and Galatians, and it speaks a bit about the tension between, or the tension perhaps about the laws. I think that's a fair way to say it, the law itself. To what degree should you still follow Jewish law? Is it important to be a Jew before you can become a Christian? Do you have to adhere to all these traditions? Because in the times that followed after Jesus basically disappears, there is a bit of confusion about other people's joining the followers of the way. And then there's confusion about what can we eat? Can we eat together? Do we have to be circumcised? This and this and this. This gets discussed in the chapter, and Aaron has probably got something to say on top of that, or no? Is there anything I missed? Probably a lot, but this is the gist I got.
I mean, it's just interesting to specifically compare. I think James and Paul. I think that's really the main interest, I would say, and then sort of you can possibly group together. I mean, that's by the way still a question. James and Peter, more or less, like over and against Paul, and then there's the question: to what extent is this, let's say, a conflict? Like, I think Paul in the letter to the Galatians is very clearly, let's say, he sounds angry and emotional. So in some sense, you can imagine him really being, let's say, infuriated about this. But at the same time, maybe it was like a minor instance, but others are making out to be one of the major conflicts in the history of the Christian church. So I'm not saying, obviously, we shouldn't look ahead because we're focusing on what's happening here in this time. But those were just some thoughts that I had, and I mean, we can go into specifics on what specifically is different about the two letters. But as for an overall idea,
Sure.
I think that's fine. But maybe there are other additions by Michael or GP as to the general contours before we get into the
Sure.
specific contents.
Michael, anything you'd like to add?
I think by way of preamble and preface, I think you've got the main kind of scaffolding there of
Sure.
the tension between, like, what kind of came through to me was like the tension between adherence to law versus more of a spiritual holy connection to Jesus as like the foundation of the Christian faith. Like, what is faith founded on? Is it founded on adherence to moral law, or is it founded on adherence to the word, which may, come in contrast to that, like what Boss was talking about with the preparation of food, for example, with like meat and cheese being separated traditionally in Jewish kitchens, but then Jesus being like, this is okay, and watching certain people break those traditions. There's that tension between, is that defiling God, or is there something that transcends law, transcends and includes maybe? I think that's a really interesting
Nice.
thing to
Yeah,
think
really
about.
good. Really good. GP, anything coming up for you at the start here?
I mean, I would agree with everything that's been said so far. I would just maybe add or emphasize that it's maybe not just a issue of whether to follow law or not, or how to follow law, but in a deeper way is about what is this movement? Is this movement a movement within Judaism? Is it principally Jewish? Is Jesus coming to kind of reform or renew Judaism? Or is it something else, which seems to be more Paul's position? It's something radically new. It's something that, in a sense, supersedes the Jewish people in a way. Now, God's people is the Christian church. So, in that sense, it's incredibly important, I think. And so I can see why people would place a lot of importance on this event because it could have spelt the difference between Christianity being a Jewish movement, a Jewish sect, and it becoming what it actually became. So in that sense, it seems quite significant.
Yeah.
That's a really good thing to think about, actually. The
And
Jewish
and
aspect, which comes forth in the chosen, the
yeah.
adaptation of the Gospels, a lot. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, I was also interested in that. I just wanted to say that I'm actually not entirely sure whether, I mean, like, I think it's clear from the text too that that our dad isn't either, but like not entirely sure whether the James in the letter is the same James as Jesus' brother. Um, it could be the case, but there are a few things that are not discussed necessarily here that I think are interesting. For instance, that indeed, like, what is said at the start is that Paul, and he does this in the letter to the Corinthians, so this will come up later, but it's already mentioned here, was that um, Jesus appeared to James, to his brother James, which is just so interesting, right? Like it's his own brother, and like he didn't really care about it during the lifetime, or at least not so much, but that he did after his death, which is interesting because an appearance of Jesus to Paul had the effect of this cosmic truth that is radically new, as GP has also said, but the appearance of Jesus to James, if we are to believe that this James is the same James that wrote that letter, does not include that whole cosmic principle. It seems to me like it's much more so Jesus as a moral teacher who he takes inspiration from. So I just think that's interesting, and therefore, indeed, that in James it's much more a reformation of sort of the Judaism, whereas you couldn't say the same as in Paul. And perhaps one thing that I definitely want to talk about today is also Paul's use of the word angels and principalities, which so reminded me of everything we've seen with John Vervaeke and Jonathan Peugeot, etc., like over the last few years, how they discussed angels. So that could, I think, it'd be an interesting discussion too.
That's all good to me. Do you want to start at James, or do you have a specific direction you were thinking of going into?
I would definitely start at Paul because at least if we're reading it this way,
Sure.
then James is responding to Paul, and even like and I think so. This would be arguing that James is written by the actual brother of Jesus, so that actually argues for an early date, but still later than Paul's letter to the Galatians. But some people think that the James letter is even like far later if it's not written by that same brother of Jesus. But in any case, I would say like I think Paul's letter just simply comes first. I think the best thing to start off with, even though it was clear from the text, is just to state the main conflict that it starts off with between Paul and Peter in I think it was in Antioch or not, with the Gentiles. Okay, sorry. Like I'm just checking.
Yes,
Don't
yes.
don't
I
fact
think I think
check
it was in
me.
Antioch.
Ask GP, man. He'll know.
It was
Okay.
Antioch, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
Do you want to, I don't know, reiterate the story, let's say, of why Paul is so upset by what is taking place there, GP? And also perhaps share some of your initial thoughts on it?
Sure. Yeah. So, just from memory, so Paul's in Antioch. Everyone's eating together. The Christian community is gathered. Sorry, I just read Michael's comment. Um, everyone's gathered together in that Christian community in Antioch. They're essentially eating together at the same tables. Because of that, Jews are bringing their food, Gentiles are bringing their food, and they're kind of sharing it around. Some men from James come along and basically say, this is unacceptable because kosher's being broken, basically. Because I think, like Michael pointed out, meat and cheese were being sort of like maybe cooked together, maybe served in the same dish. There's a whole lot of purity laws around dishes becoming unkosher, you see. So, in any case, like he said, that the messengers from James said this is unacceptable. You have to have separate tables for Jews and Gentiles. So they split up, except for Paul, who stubbornly remained with I think a Jew and a Gentile on his table, and and that's sort of the origin of that. Paul thinks this is unacceptable. He thinks that this would split the community. Thinks this is not in the spirit of Jesus. Um, and yeah, and I that's basically the incident. We could talk more about like how Paul deals with it in Galatians, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's good. That's good. And then there's other like what's also interesting I think about the chapter is that it speaks to the letter to the Galatians both working on a psychological level, that obviously Paul himself was so obsessed with the law before his mystical experience on the road to Damascus, that like he psychologically really struggles with that notion of the old, and he wants to revolve around the new, renewal that is brought by Jesus and that he experiences too. Similarly, like we could talk about theology, which was indeed the aspect of angels that I spoke about, and about whether or not the law is time bound or eternal. And finally, rhetorical is like I think the third main pillar, where Paul very, I don't know, cleverly uses some pretty interesting terminology in order to sort of probably argue for his own authority in conveying some of these points, I'd say. So there's lots, I think, to go off there. Yeah. And I'm just curious, perhaps we could stay with the conflict, or with that conflict. What are your intuitions about it before we even start looking at the letters themselves? Are your intuitions that Paul is essentially right? Is there something to be said for Peter and James being a little bit more conservative here, I guess? So I'm just kind of curious how everyone feels about it, because I haven't properly made up my mind about it.
Smart move. Smart move. Uh, Intuitively, I'm all in with Paul. I really like it. It's for me, it is this radical change in the way that the laws. Is that not what he said in the letter as well? That the law has been fulfilled. Is that what he said, or was
Well, I
that from
mean,
the chapter?
no, that's something that Jesus says supposedly in the Gospels,
Sure.
but therefore it's also in the chapter.
Yeah.
Because,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It comes back. That's what it felt like to me. That it was a historical thing that was fit for a certain time, and that now there's been a change
yeah.
into history, into the way we can
Yeah.
do things. So yeah, I'm on Paul's team.
And by the way, like interestingly, in the chapter, that same point is used to argue for James, not Paul, because it's like Jesus did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, which means that the law is not abolished. You know, so you can also
Yes.
read it that way, where it's like, no, the law is still valid. It is fulfilled in Jesus, but
Yeah,
it is still valid.
it's almost like more
So,
extreme in many ways, but
yeah.
it was more internal. Anyway, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just reading in the chapter, and it talks about how, for Paul, the coming of Jesus means that like people's faith in him is no longer bound by social class or um, you know, tribal allegiance, and it's kind of this unifying, like kind of unifying division dissolving kind of like faith. And so I think for him he sees I don't think he holds contempt or like disrespect for the laws, but I think he sees their limitations that like, people shouldn't worship like laws and then kind of they become this like dogmatic calcified thing. But to ultimately look to Jesus. I mean, it's I feel like I'm kind of conflicted because I can understand that view, but then like where does that end? Like I can very you can very easily see how that can kind of descend into anarchy. And so, but I feel like he's onto something in that like wisdom and discernment about laws, um, and that connected ultimately to Jesus is like I think what he's trying to cultivate. Um, as opposed to like, okay, this is a law that I don't know Moses gave or whatever, however they were decreed, and we just have to kind of follow that for all eternity. Um, but yeah, I think I'm kind of still conflicted because it kind of feels like both camps are quite extreme, um, in their own ways.
Hmm. Gabriel?
So I have a lot more sympathy, I think, for James and his group, in the sense, not in the sense that I fully agree, but in the sense that I just can sort of feel their perspective more, because I guess everyone's still working out what this movement is. Like I said before, is it a Jewish movement? Is it not? Um, and I don't think we have anything clear in the Gospels themselves, where Jesus like rejects kosher law or anything like that. I think there's a scene where he is confronted about kind of cleaning utensils or cleaning vessels to eat in, or cleaning your hands before you eat, things like that, where he does push back against the Pharisees and says, it's what comes out of you that defiles you, not what goes into you. But there's no explicit mention of him saying like, like kosher laws are abolished or anything like that. And so I think this is a like I can if Jesus is essentially a Jew and he's just furthering sort of the Jewish tradition, I can definitely see where James's party are coming from, because this is sort of very essential to to the Jewish tradition. Um, I also wondered reading through Galatians though whether it's only about this. It seemed like when I was reading Bass's chapter, it was sort of focused on that confrontation in Antioch. It was focused on should Greeks and Jews eat together, but in the letter to the Galatians, I think I've got it noted somewhere. He's talking about circumcision, so he's talking about the need for Greeks to become circumcised in order to even enter the community of Christians. And so I wonder if it's actually more about this issue than it is about eating at the same table.
I had the same question. I agree.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that also raises another question, which I came across just doing a bit of background reading, which is when was this letter of Galatians written? So was it written, for instance, before the Council of Jerusalem, which is described in Acts 15, where the leaders of the church basically decide, yes, Gentiles can enter the church without having to be circumcised and without having to keep kosher law? Or does it become before that, or does that come after that? And if it comes after that, why is this still an issue? And then, if it comes before that, which would seem to maybe be more in line with Paul talking about the need to be circumcised. Um, yeah, I mean, that's just another question, I guess. But I think that it's easy for someone in the modern world, especially a modern Christian, to look at it and sort of immediately side with Paul because that's where Christianity has gone. But I can see that it would be like a much more what would you say, like contentious and just like divisive issue back then.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking some of the same things that I also kind of felt that this wasn't necessarily about eating together when I read the letter. Indeed, it seemed to be more about circumcision. But I mean, like it does come up, by the way. Like I think it's like he says, I think very literally. What was it again? Let me try to find it in the text itself. Oh yeah, here I'm looking for Peter, but it's obviously it's Kephas, um, and yeah. So like so this 11, I think, Galatians 2:11, yeah. And then he says, when Kephas, so Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. So essentially, seems to be related, if that makes sense. So it is brought up. It's not entirely separate from the chapter. But I did nonetheless feel some of the same things. So like I also want to side with Paul in some ways, that I'm like, yeah, I want to argue for this radical sort of new renewal that is relevant. But I try to take things from Peter's and James' perspective, and it's just like Paul is just this almost like ridiculous figure in some sense, right? Like, so he's just this guy who persecuted them for years. He has not met Jesus when he was alive, hasn't walked with him. And then he goes up to his brother and his main disciple, and he's like, by the way, I disagree with your interpretation of,
It's
the
so
guy that
funny.
you knew so well.
Yeah.
And then I mean, he appeared to me in a mystical vision, which is like, fair enough. It could be relevant, but I'm just like thinking, like what if this was kind of like one of these, I don't know, just this like a misguided interpretation of like an ayahuasca type sort of experience. And then I could totally imagine them being like, dude, this Paul guy is a bit intense. Like, why? Like, so I want to side a little bit with them. Having said that, I really liked the letter by James. I thought it was great. I also felt it was like a very general letter. It seems to refer back to many themes also in the Old Testament. Like, it's a really wonderful letter to read. But it doesn't seem like he properly understands Paul. Like, I don't think Paul actually says something to the extent. Like, obviously, Paul here defends Abraham living by faith, not by works. And, and the other aspect, obviously, being therefore that faith is more important than whatever works you do. But similarly, like, I think Paul would clearly agree that sort of faith without works is empty. And that's why, like, I shouldn't look ahead too much, but we're going to read the letter to the Corinthians where he says, like the very famous, like, if I boast, etc., but I have not love, then it's all empty. So like it seems like it's necessary to be more, I don't know, participatory about some of these aspects, not just like propositionally assent to the claim that Jesus has died for our sins and is sort of born again. So I do also want to defend Paul against a potential straw man in James. Having said that, I totally understand James's potential frustration with this guy, if I could put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, so do I. I'm curious if there's a distinction between, so I'm looking at Galatians 3:2,
Okay.
where Paul is just saying how foolish the Galatians are,
Yeah.
and kind of points to that, like, just kind of like passionate zeal that you're talking about, Aaron, where he says, I would like to learn just one thing from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law or by believing what you heard? Are you so foolish? And then he goes on. And I feel like that kind of puts a little bit more meat on the bone of what I was saying earlier of like, I feel like there's a distinction between, so like what you were mentioning, Aaron, with like how you live out your faith. Is it through just prayer and worship, or is it through your good deeds and your works? I feel like there's a distinction between that and and how you receive the Spirit. So there's like how you instantiate your faith, but then there's also like how you receive um the message of God. Is that through, kind of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit through like direct communication with Jesus the mediator, or is it through the commandments, the law? What is the basis for, I guess, spiritual discernment, spiritual um wisdom, and I think where Paul's coming from is like now that now that Jesus has died and been risen again, like we have to kind of expand our idea or something of how we think about faith from just follow the law, to okay, there's this figure now that is kind of like the divine law, and not to abolish one in favor of the other, but like integrate both of them. That's kind of how I'm seeing Paul now.
Mhm.
I'm curious
Michael,
what your thoughts are on
I,
that.
I found that verse really important as well, 3:2. My translation, which is the ESV, says, let me ask you only this, did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by hearing with faith? And I think when I read that, it sort of something clicked for me and I became much more sympathetic to Paul, and sort of where he's coming from, because sort of Pauline theology, if you will, is often portrayed as it is propositional. It is just about believing, and then magically, so to speak, you're redeemed and etc. etc. Which I've never been very sympathetic to. But here, Paul is actually saying, this is your experience. Like your experience was that you heard the word, and the Spirit came upon you, basically, which is an experience. Like it's some kind of mystical experience. Um, it sounds like it was often accompanied by miracles, so it was like effective in the world. So it's not something to be trifled with, and so I think that made me a lot more sympathetic to where Paul's coming from. He's speaking from experience. He's saying this. Um, this is real, this is transformative, and this is more important than the law, because there's a different kind of consciousness when you're thinking of the law, sort of reading the law and you're applying it to your life, you're following duty. Like there's a totally different sort of way of being and consciousness. And I think that came out as well, I think a bit later in the letter. Something else that was really interesting for me that sort of opened my mind to a different way of seeing things was a bit later in the letter. So this would be sort of around chapter 5. So chapter 5:13, I think. For you are called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. And he goes on to talk a bit more about that. Um, and I found that really interesting because I've always thought, like, like if you're going to do away with the law, like there's a sort of problem here, right? There's a problem of sin, there's a problem of how you deal with evil, of how you regulate your behavior. If you're going to do away with the law, then can't you just do anything you like? Like, isn't that what freedom implies? Um, but what Paul is saying is that I feel like Paul should have emphasized spirit more than he did faith, right? Because what he's saying is that there's something in you, something dwelling in you that guides you, that shows you what to do, that inspires you. This is the thing that you need to follow. And this is again a different kind of experience, a different kind of consciousness than
Mhm.
reading a book, extrapolating what laws you have to follow, and making yourself do them, right? I think that's also a key element, is sort of like it
Mm,
seems like Paul found he was able to do things he wasn't previously able to do because of what he would consider his sinful nature, through the Spirit, right? So he had that kind of freedom as well. Whereas if you're thinking about law, you're almost automatically thinking about what's my duty? What do I have to make myself do in spite of my desires? And I think he's also pointing at that, like when it comes to law, when you're in the consciousness of law and duty, you're not in the consciousness of I'm so full of love that I just want to express that, and So I think for me, that's where it kind of came together for me. Was like it's all about the spirit basically.
Hmm.
And he even says like if you don't actually follow the spirit, then essentially you won't be saved. Let's see,
Yeah,
where does he say?
yeah,
I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. So there is not a
hmm,
complete freedom after all, but it's a freedom that allows for like a different kind of following that's not
Hmm.
legalistic but inspired, I guess.
yeah. I mean,
Hmm.
and I think this comes back to like conversation I've had with Lucas so many times, just about obviously a different understanding of freedom. That it's not this libertarian freedom from constraints, but it's always this freedom to live in a certain manner. So
Hmm.
it's a positive sense of freedom that indeed is characterized not by absence but by the presence of
Hmm.
something. And indeed, the word that is used, like in the 5:13 that you just quoted, it can also be translated even as slave, which is just like as opposed to serving, it will be slaving. So you can
Mm.
also, this is how Dave Bentley Hart translates it: you were called to freedom, brothers, only let this freedom not serve as an occasion for the flesh, rather slave for one another by love. So the freedom that you're called to is to be slave to each other in
Yeah.
love, and that's freedom. So obviously, like
Hmm.
it seems like this subversion of what we understand to be freedom. And by the way,
Hmm.
I would also respond to the other aspect, which is that I am okay with him emphasizing faith, but only faith understood not in the James strawman way, or indeed how it has sometimes been interpreted by, for instance, I guess Luther is fair to say. Uh, funny story, by the way. Luther really disliked the letter by James. He disliked
Mm.
it so much that it was like, it contradicts what Paul is saying. We want to follow Paul. We dislike what James has to say, so he just put it in his appendix in the Bible that he included, even though it was there before that. What I would say is that indeed, it's much more about faith in the sense of loyalty, right? Faithfulness, and not faith in the sense of propositional belief. So I do like that sense of faith because it says something that could be very much characterized by spirit, but we read it in the sense of propositional belief, which I think is
Hmm.
wrong. Yeah, but
Yeah.
I agree with the point of experience, so I really like that aspect.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll just be quick, and I'm curious what Lucas has to say, but it reminds me of, I think it's Rousseau who said like freedom is the ability to choose your own constraints, which feels very, you know, kind of paradoxical in a sense, but um, like ultimate the idea of freedom is like unlimited choice is actually completely inverted. Like there's this, I don't know if you're familiar, there's this paradox called the Berdin, I think it's like the Berdin donkey paradox, where basically there's this donkey who is in front of two equally sized bales of hay. And instead of just choosing one, he gets so paralyzed by which hay bale to choose that he just starves to death. And I have this philosopher friend who like cites it all the time. And he's like, that's kind of like the modern age is like we have this unlimited choice. And actually, instead of people just choosing one and like, you know, being happy and content with it, they're just flooded. And it's like the paralysis by analysis kind of like syndrome. Um, and I think that um, that sense of you know faithfulness in God being not this like granting of just like unlimited freedom and choice and oh God's telling me to do this today, God's telling me to do that tomorrow, like it's it's like it's a constraint because there is only like one right choice at a given time, right? It's like whatever honors God. Um, but it's like this kind of mysterious adventure into love as opposed to like strict, you know, adherence to law. There's also I don't remember if it was this week or last week, but there was a verse where I think it was Jesus who was talking about like, do you follow laws given by man or by God? I don't know if one of you remember. I feel like it's just kind of like throughout, maybe like a ubiquitous idea. Um, and I don't know enough about like the kind of legalistic frameworks of the Jews to like speak with much authority on this, but like, you know, those laws presumably were constructed by Jews who, like wanted to honor God through those, but um there's there's maybe like a tension there between like, am I following a law that was socially constructed or um given on high by God or something.
Thank you, Michael. Um, yeah, really beautiful things that you all have said thus far. I especially like the spirit being the strongest, I guess. I tend to think about it similarly, where the law is to come out of spirit in a way, and this looking at the laws in a spiritual manner means that you adhere to them without feeling much constraint yourself. So internalizing the laws. But then I think a good point is that socially constructed aspect you just named. Also the vulnerability of the word. The word is vulnerable to become worldly, or through human hands use some of the divine origins, whence it might have come from. And so that's why I think spirit is always more important, and why I think a law can, I don't know if a law can ever be absolute. It's within history, it's within place, it's within context. And then there's always a danger of falling prey to relativism and such things. But the reason why I intuitively immediately sided with Paul in the kosher situation is because, like, yes, obviously, these are our brothers and sisters. We need to eat with them. Some laws work against spirit in certain contexts. So yeah, that's kind of what I've felt thus far. But I'm wondering how to navigate the tension between the law and the spirit without becoming completely anarchistic and or becoming too lawful, too legalistic. But I basically think the key is in the coming of Christ. I think it's just and that's the theme with all of these things that we're reading, right? Like, what are we humans supposed to do with it? Where these groups of people, even though they might have known Jesus, or there may be prophets in our midst, we're still just a bunch of humans trying to figure it out, and it's extremely it's just messy. It's messy now in my own thoughts, just as it was messy then between the people that were trying to figure it out. And so the collective consciousness is necessary here to figure it out. And it's funny, immediately as Aaron asked, what do you guys think, we see how we think about it differently and how we're helping each other kind of, well, actually you guys are helping me to figure out some things where we're not fully grasping it. Yeah, that's what I'll say.
Do you think
Lucas.
that the Galatians 3 title, faith or works of the law, do you think that distinction and tension, Aaron, you mentioned Luther earlier, like that seems like a prefiguring of the Reformation to me. Like that seems like a huge tension
Depending on how you
during the
interpret it.
Reformation.
But yeah, like essentially, some people say that Luther took Paul's side in the conflict between faith and works, and that it's all about faith and not about works, because you can't earn your way to salvation by performing acts. Like, you need to have, let's say, this personal relationship to Jesus. And Paul very beautifully describes how Jesus, let's say, is now in him, that with Jesus' crucifixion, Paul also died, and now sort of with Jesus there's this new human being. So that is all that is relevant. But that also means that, I don't know, I think we can see the dark side to this. Not to mention Luther's anti-Semitism. That is also, I think, I'm not sure if it's motivating his theological reading, but it's just unfortunate that that's sort of part of it. Anyways, yeah. So yeah, I do see it foreshadowing it. But staying with the text, I'm assuming GP, you had something relevant to say. Something
I was
relevant.
just going to respond to Lucas because he was
Uh,
wondering, Lucas, you were wondering about, can any law be absolute? Interestingly, both Paul in Galatians and James in his letter do cite a law, which kind of, with definitely with approval, which is love your neighbor as yourself. So this is an interesting kind of law because it kind of escapes lawfulness in a way, right? It forces you in a lived, embodied way to put yourself into the perspective of someone else and do whatever that situation requires. So it's a kind of paradoxical law. It's a law that escapes lawfulness. And I find it interesting that both these writers cite that law as being really important.
yeah.
Yeah, that's the
Mm.
beauty of language when it becomes paradoxical. That's to me when it hits its peak.
Yeah. It's, by the way, like just a fun fact. Kant really thought this was nice but problematic. That it's like as yourself. I mean, that makes it subjective. Like you should love. You should be good unconditionally and not simply because of the way that you want to be treated, etc. So
Shut up,
it's
Kant.
just,
Get out of the room. Be gone.
yeah. So, anyways, I think so. Can we just go through the letter to the Galatians a little bit, chapter by chapter, like not in detail, but so we can do if we could finish that off before we move
Sure.
on to James.
Yeah.
So just to ask, for instance, for instance, what I noticed with chapter one was indeed that not as per usual that he is all like, wow. Thank you so much. But he moved very quickly, like in verse 6 already. By I am astounded or I'm shocked that you are so quickly deflecting from the one. And it even seems a little bit arrogant, I should say, that he's kind of like, I came to you, giving you the true words of Jesus, and you are straying from my message, essentially. Because other people are also claiming they're giving, let's say, Jesus' message. But he's like, that's not Jesus' real message. So I'm just saying, and it might be true. Like, obviously, if I was Paul and if I had this experience and I would be sure this would be the Jesus, then, then it makes sense that you would be so certain. But at the same time, like, there's no epistemic humility, let's say, on Paul's side here, where he immediately gets into that. And he goes as far as saying, and this is sort of in 1 verse 8, and this is what I wanted to talk about with the angels, even if we or an angel out of heaven should proclaim to you good tidings that differ from what you received, which is from what you received from Paul, right? Let him be accursed, which is just so interesting. Like, even if an angel from heaven came down now and told you, it's like, don't believe him, which says something indeed about his understandings of angels, which is very different from how we look at it. It's more similar to indeed angels in the sense of principalities, and that perhaps angels can also be fallen angels, the Nephilim that we read about, let's say, in the Old Testament. So I think that's really how we ought to think of it. But still, like, I just want you to realize how radical some of this is. And then obviously also that he says that he spent 15 days with Peter in Jerusalem, which I do like to read because, or like I did like to read that because I'd like to think then that all of those days were spent in heavy dialogue, learning from Peter everything that Jesus had to say. Because otherwise, I feel kind of like this one mystical experience is great and fantastic, but he would not really know how Jesus lived, etc. And I'm just happy that he did, in fact, converse with Peter and with his brother James. Anyways, those are some things about chapter 1. Any other comments or response to anything I said about chapter 1? I'm curious.
I would just kind of emphasize what you said, Aaron. I'll be honest. I don't like Paul. I don't like Paul as a character. He's neurotic. He's arrogant. He's got this fundamentalist zealotry. I don't I don't like him as a character. But like I was saying before, I have got more sympathy for him now, I think, reading through Galatians, seeing where he's coming from. But it's interesting in both the letters of James and in Galatians, they talk about dissensions, in Galatians, is that 5:20 when he's listing things that are not of the Spirit. He's talking about rivalries, so dissensions, divisions, envy, jealousy, strife. So it's interesting how much these things about division come into his list of evil things alongside in sexual immorality, idolatry, etc. And I think James also talks a lot against dissension and so forth.
Yeah.
Um, what's ironic though is that they're both, which is very human and very natural, but they're both sort of saying the other party is the problem. If only they just stuck to the truth, then we wouldn't have to have this problem. It's because you're being bad that we have this division. And I wouldn't see it like that.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's good. Yeah, obviously I also want to be more sympathetic to Paul, especially because also looking at the chronology, you can imagine that even probably the Gospels have been influenced by Paul, right? Which is just crazy. Like everything we know about Jesus, including the Gospels themselves, probably has been influenced by Paul. Mark, if it was truly the earliest, least of all, but even John Mark had contact with Paul. Which is why I believe there's one scholar who says that the most influential individual of all times is not Jesus but Paul, which is just crazy. But at the same time, like I understand where they would be coming from. I also thought it would be interesting to look at the argument that he gave with regards to Abraham, right? Like, so it was about faith, not about works. But then he also says, and this is verse 13, chapter 3. And again, I have a bit of an odd translation because it's the David Bentley Hart translation. But you can read along. The Anointed redeemed us from the law's curse, becoming a curse on our behalf, because there's been written, accursed is everyone hanging upon a tree, so that in Jesus the Anointed, the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. Which I just think is interesting because it's kind of like indeed our doctrine that he took the sins upon the world, right? It seems to like originate almost in this interpretation of it, which is something that Nietzsche also took issue with later, but that's I think another conversation. But I think nonetheless is kind of relevant, right? Like that's like, okay, he says, obviously if the law would be valid, then Jesus would be, let's say, would be, how do you say it? He would be betraying the law by hanging upon a tree. He would be cursed. But clearly he is not cursed because he is the main inspiration behind this all. So like he's also using this, I think, rhetorically to talk to them, right? Like, okay, if you truly think that the law, if you disrespect the law, then you are accursed. Then you should disrespect Jesus, but you don't disrespect Jesus because indeed in him it's sort of the end of the law. So this was kind of like a wink of God to say like, haha, it's a reference to that, that saying we have in the Old Testament that accursed is everyone hanging upon a tree. So then clearly if God himself hangs upon a tree, then we can see that the law no longer is valid in the same way. So I think it's just an interesting argument that could be relevant. And another aspect that I want to mention, which is, I think, nice and does speak to him having understood something about Jesus himself, what he said, and what he probably, I think, got from listening to Peter, which is chapter 4, verse 6. And it says, since you are sons, God sent forth his Son Spirit into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father, which is obviously something we discussed already so much, right? Like that, indeed, this is the main revolution of Jesus, of saying Abba. And later on in chapter 4, that he talks about the difference between Hagar and I think Sarah, right? Is that correct? So you have the slave woman and the free woman, and he says we are inheritors of the free woman. But I think it's interesting that already for Paul it's just self-evident that we interpret these things allegorically. So that's just interesting against some fundamentalists who are like, we have to read everything super literally. But already Paul in his time, in his age, was like, yeah, these things are told allegorically. I think this is verse 24 of chapter 4. So those are just some things. And then the last thing I want to talk about is indeed between the spirit and the flesh, because it is nice, but I think it's also dualistic and potentially problematic. And the really nice thing, see with what large letters I have written to you with my own hand. Verse 11 of chapter 6, where he just tries to prove it's really me, I am writing it. So I think some of those details are just very interesting. Okay, sorry, those are many things, but I'm just curious if some of them stand out for you before we move on to James.
I'm good. I'm ready to move. Michael, good.
Yeah, I think just like really quickly, like what you said there, Aaron, was really great. The line about the that you read, I can't find it now. Cursed is everyone who, in my translation, is cursed is everyone who's hung on a pole. Christ
Yeah,
redeems us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, for it is written. And then he talks about how like through the redemption of Christ, like that um that truth is extended not just to Jews but to Gentiles as well. Like the blessing given to Abraham might come to the Gentiles through Christ Jesus. Um, I agree with GP. I also find Paul a hard read, but I think that is like so profoundly radical in like a beautiful way.
yeah,
Um, that yeah, that just really resonated with me. So,
yeah,
but that's
yeah.
kind of all I have.
I do think Paul's really engaging though. Like I really like, I don't know, like especially this letter. It's just like wow, like oh my god, it's intense. But yeah, thanks, Michael. And GP, anything, or do we move on
No,
to
I
James?
mean, there's a bunch of things I guess I could say, but I think we'll move on to James.
Yeah. And by the way, David Bentley Hart also says in his footnotes that Paul really is a little bit more dualistic than we sometimes like to admit. That indeed, like it is all about rejection of the flesh in favor of the spirit, and I do see how that lends itself to this. If Pauline Christianity becomes relevant, then that gets mixed with this superficial Platonic understanding of Christianity, where everything earthly is rotten and wrong. And even James is gonna say you should not be friends of the earth. We'll get there soon. Like you should. So I understand the Nietzschean criticism coming about, even though I think it covers one aspect of it and not the whole thing, because I see like a complete struggle. But yeah, that's just to finish off with the letter to the Galatians. Um, and yeah, okay, let's go on to James, who has some things to say.
The tongue. The tongue that was spoken of as what did he say exactly about it? I don't know if you have a quote pulled up, but it is the most dangerous. I like the
Oh
analogy
yeah,
of like the tongue is like the tiny part, but it can make the whole, it can make like the whole being corrupt or something like that. I thought it was a funny way of thinking about it. But do you remember what he analogized that with? The tongue with something else?
this was I think James 3.
A ship.
A ship.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Or he has like multiple analogies. And it's 3-3 for me. When we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go.
Yeah.
Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. And then he talks about a forest set on fire by a small
Yeah,
spark,
yeah, yeah.
and the tongue is, yeah, it's so good, it's so great.
Yeah, that's really good stuff. And the tongue is for me also a bit of an analogy to I don't know, the potential we have as humans to inflict destruction but also do good, like our creative faculty that animals don't have or don't have as much. that we as humans have this ability to kind of do inflict so much damage and also do so much good, and the tongue is a, I don't know, it's a beautiful image of that, you know, and it's so small, and it has multiple functions as well. Acceptation, as Ricky would say, like. But yeah, any one of you guys have any other thoughts about James?
I
I was
loved
just,
James.
oh, go ahead, JP.
So I'd read it probably a couple of times in the past, and it hadn't impressed me very much. It sort of just seemed like a collection of moral advice or something like that. But for some reason, for some reason, going into it this time, maybe with the background of Galatians, I really, really liked it, and I thought it was really sort of deep in a way. Um, I mean, it is kind of a little bit scattered and seems to talk about different, lot of different topics. I think it's interesting with reference to the tongue, like there is an emphasis on boasting, and I think there's an emphasis on boasting throughout the letter, which I think fits into that, to his sort of criticism of what he sees as being Paul's side of the debate, which is sort of the faith is everything, which is a kind of a boast, right? Um,
Yeah.
if it's not followed through with works. It's a bit like Peter saying, "Yes, Lord, I'll follow you to your death." You know, when he hasn't actually been tested. But I found it really interesting because of the different, let's say, valence placed on law, like the word law in James versus Galatians. Law is very negative in Galatians, but in James, it's very, very positive. So I think it is chapter 1, verse 25. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. So here, law is playing a very, very positive role.
Yeah.
Um, I found the whole of chapter 2 very interesting, and I was kind of puzzling over it for a while, because I felt like it was maybe giving um, James's sort of theology, or James's, let's say, soteriology, his theory of salvation or redemption, which is maybe distinct from Paul. I saw a lot of resonances also with the Gospel of Matthew. So the things that he kind of references,
Spoilers,
very much.
spoilers. We're
Yes,
not
right.
there yet.
So the Gospel of Matthew, particularly the Sermon on the Mount, and Matthew being the gospel where I would say Jesus as the fulfiller of the law in the sense of the keeper of the law is very much emphasized. And so this maybe is James's view, and maybe Matthew and James are sort of in the same circle of Jewish followers of Jesus who are still keeping the law. But when I read chapter 2 of James, I was trying to sort of puzzle out his theory on this. So he talks about a rich man coming into your community and a poor man, and you privilege the rich man, and you tell the poor man to go sit over there or stand or whatever, sit at my feet. And then he says, "Have you then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts?" So I thought that was really interesting. Judges with evil thoughts. Um, Seems a little bit maybe disconnected from just sort of privileging one person over another. It seems to sort of again hark back to maybe Matthew, maybe the Sermon on the Mount. You know, the idea that if you judge others, you will be judged. Um, and so he goes on to say, what's really interesting is he goes on to say in chapter 2, verse 10, something that Paul also says. He says, for whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of all of it. So I found that really interesting because it seems to be making the same point as Paul. And you could interpret it, I think, in one of two ways. First of all, you could say that he's just advocating the law. So he is taking a very strict view of the law, and he's saying you actually have to fulfill all of it, every part of it, else you won't be justified or something like that, if he even uses the same concepts as Paul in that regard. But anyway, you have to follow the whole law. Or the other option is that he could be saying, because he says a bit further down at verse 13, or verse 12, I should say, so speak and so act as those who are to be judged under the law of liberty, for judgment is without mercy to one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. And so again, that also harks back to Matthew. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. And so I sort of got the sense that maybe his idea of what Jesus is doing with the law is and how just a normal fallible human being can be saved is that the key thing is to show mercy, and that showing mercy means not judging, and not judging means not privileging one person over another based on their external characteristics, and that all these things go together,
Hmm.
and that if you show mercy, then mercy will be shown to you. So it doesn't matter if you follow every single law or if you slip up and break one. But then at verse 10, what he's saying is that if you don't show mercy, God will judge you severely. That is to say, God will judge you as breaking the whole law if you break one part of it. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
that's a different theory
Yeah.
to Paul's theory
Hmm.
about
Hmm.
salvation, but it's one that's consonant with Jesus, at least the Jesus in Matthew. So I found that
Yeah.
really, really fascinating. Is
Yeah.
maybe this was a competing theory at the time. Maybe this is a different way of looking at what Jesus was saying. The key idea being, be merciful to others, and God will be merciful to you in regard to your, let's say, unavoidable slips that mean that you
Yeah.
will break the law.
Yeah.
But still follow the law. Still try and follow the law.
I love the
Yeah.
emphasis on the mercy there. It's really like also makes it more proactive. It's less of a don't do that and it's more of a do this. And
Hmm.
I personally just really enjoy that in terms
Yeah.
of, improving as a person. It makes more sense for me when I hear that. I find it easier to apply.
Yeah, I had highlighted the same section, so I really enjoyed your explanation of it. I think it's a really, I don't know, it's a really good way of putting how James, or perhaps many people, and especially if this is the same James that was so influential. It's crazy if you think about it, right? James, Peter, and Paul, and that it's just like that first century that Paul is, a marginal figure compared to the big bishop like figure James, um, who also indeed opens up the letter by speaking to the 12 tribes of the diaspora, right? Like this idea that indeed there's a renewed Israel, the new 12 tribes. So all of that is just fascinating. And my question to you also would be like, does this also mean that he has a different understanding of who Jesus is? Like, has is Jesus just a new prophet with an interesting new moral message, emphasizing mercy, or is he more than that? Because indeed, what we get in the Gospel of Mark is that the centurion says, "Truly, this was the Son of God, or the Son of a God, at least." And I think like I'm just looking for like the references to Jesus, and like there's one obviously in the first verse where it's like James, a slave of God and of Lord Jesus the Anointed. So it's clear that he does, I don't know, or a servant. You could also translate it that way. Like he pledges his allegiance to Jesus, and then later on, I think he does so again in chapter 2, in verse 1, where he says, "My brothers, hold to the faith of our Lord, glory Jesus the Anointed, without any respecting of persons." Um, which is interesting because that could be the faith of our Lord, which could again be another moral message, like that faith that Jesus showed. Try to show that too, which is far closer. And I am intuiting, GP, that this might be also one reason why you like it indirectly, is that Jesus, like what Nietzsche emphasized, what he liked about Jesus was indeed this new way of life, not a new doctrine, etc. It was really, and this shows like, okay, the way that Jesus believed and looked at the world, like that's how we ought to act as well. But there's no clear sign here I could find of someone having a mystical appearance of Jesus, which Paul says that James did after, like, that Jesus appeared to him after his life. So I'm just kind of curious what you make of that. That I also like lots of what's in here, but do we get a cosmic Jesus here? I'm curious. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Oh, I think it's interesting that although Jesus is mentioned a couple of times, or maybe a few times, but not too much, but it doesn't seem, at least I don't recall him ever being mentioned in the aspect of like sacrificial lamb or sacrifice as atonement for sins, or any of these concepts that are so central to Paul.
Yeah.
So I think I think you're probably correct in the sense that for James, it's Jesus' moral teaching and his example, like his lived example of living out that teaching in his life, that is the most important thing. Um, in terms of the vision, well, I mean, who knows? I like James better because he's not talking about his visions. Maybe it's more it's more appropriate just to keep your visions to yourself. But
Yeah, Lucas. I'm just kidding. Yeah.
whereas Paul again, like Paul is somewhat annoying because he boasts and he claims authority, but he also claims extreme humility at the same time, at least in my perception, and that's why he grates on me. So I'd be very willing to believe that James really did see the resurrected Jesus, maybe even conversed with him, um, but he just doesn't need to talk about it. I guess he doesn't need to talk about it also because he has presumably has established authority in the church, so
Yeah.
he doesn't need to prove his authority. So that's something else that
He also doesn't mention in this letter, by the way, I'm the brother of Jesus.
that's
Just so you
true.
know. Which is
That's
like,
true.
yeah.
Which again could be because it's not written by James, the brother of Jesus. It could also be because everyone knows who he is and his authority is established. He doesn't need to say it. He doesn't need to remind people. Whereas Paul always needs to remind people that he saw Jesus. He was transformed by Jesus. He was commissioned by Jesus on a special mission. Because otherwise he has no authority because he kind of came out of nowhere, or worse, he came from persecuting the church.
Yeah.
Um, so I think, yeah, I'd agree
But
with
by
a
the
lot of
way,
what
I would say, like, just in defense of Paul, the way that he so radically changed his life is kind of evidence in some ways of like, okay, this wasn't just, let's say, him phoning it in, just kind of like, oh, by the way, I saw him. It's like, no, he completely changed after that, like, completely, right? And he turned blind, and then he went to the desert, etc. So all of
Sure.
that is there. So I do think it's authentic on Paul's behalf, but I still think, nonetheless, that your criticism, if I can put it that way, is valid. Yeah.
Well, there was something brought up at the start of this conversation. I forget who mentioned it. It might have been you, Aaron, but it was essentially like two people could have a vision, let's say,
Yeah.
of the same individual, but they might get different things from that. That individual might say different things to them. So that's a really interesting question too. Did
Yeah.
James receive a different message? Did he have a different experience than
Mm,
Paul? And
mm,
what does that mean? Does it mean that they're just subjective experiences? Does it mean that there's like a issue of like mediation, like Paul refers to in terms of the law coming down to Israel, right? Like, is it mediated through their psychology? Is it mediated through the concepts in their mind? I would think it would have to be, but that's a problem, I think, for Paul's theology, where it's like everything else was mediated, but this is the real thing. This is straight from God. But I don't know if anything can ever not be mediated to some extent.
Mhm. Yeah, good point. I don't know. Any theories, guys?
Of course, it has to be mediated, in my view.
Yeah.
I think always. That's what makes us human, and that at the same time is why, the going back to the law, why that is the risk of that. Even the church, the risk of the church. I think that's what Jonathan Piget also mentioned of like Saint Peter, and it to me, to think that these are the people that brought us the foundations of Christianity. They're the same people that even when Jesus was still alive were straying. Think about Peter betraying him and such things. And to me, it's just a reminder of those people were just as human as we are. So we're all mediators, but I think they were closer to Jesus as a person and then as something else. So that we have a lot to learn from them. But so yeah, it's a bit of that. GP and I spoke about this. What is it? Immanence and transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
That's what calls to mind for me. Mediation is reminding me of that.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
it also seems I'm just reading the last chapter of or subheading under chapter 5 of James, the prayer of faith, and 5:16. Therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. Um, back to kind of the question of like the messages between between James and Paul, and kind of what their maybe what their role is in the formation of the church. Like it feels like Paul is um you know I think he sees himself as kind of a prophet, like and a messenger of sorts, and kind of a very zealous, like aggressive one at that. And I think James also sees himself as that as well. But it feels like there's a heart of um, healing in his message, and it seems like Paul is more, you know, the kind of change your life like uh mantra, whatever, it seems central in his as well. But it's kind of that feeling that you sometimes get from leaders who are kind of trying to like shake people awake from a slumber, but it feels kind of like judgmental and kind of like kind of aggressive at the same time. And it feels like James is a lot more grounded and calm and I don't know, dare I say loving in his approach. And it yeah, and that sense of like he's kind of leaving himself out of it, and he's letting the wisdom of God lead, you know, and guide his message, as opposed to keeping himself central. But I think everything that you said, GP and Aaron, about kind of Paul's reason for that, and kind of rooted in this need to like establish authority. Because I imagine a lot of people may be quite distrustful, like, oh, okay, this guy had one vision and now he's anointing himself as this like prophet like figure, and how to kind of garner support and legitimacy in that is like
And he's the same guy who probably killed some of your family members and friends. You know,
right,
it's
right.
just like it's not that he only had the vision. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah. No, no, that's totally true. And I mean, it's kind of ironic to see these two letters in conversation with each other, because in James he talks about like, if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, like don't speak it, basically. And all of that comes from an earthly, unspiritual place. So I wonder what he would say to Paul, and like if he would even believe that his vision was grounded in the spiritual, if he feels like he needs to continue to talk about it all of the time,
Hmm.
or if it hasn't been integrated.
This is a good question, because you can also imagine that Paul really, like, that he is just convinced. Well, he clearly is, but by the fact that we have to emphasize this aspect, because it's clear that people seem to revert back to old ways almost, right? Like that indeed, like, okay, yes, this is nice and it's a new message, but essentially we can keep behaving in the same way. And I think there's something also, like, I don't exactly remember where, but I do remember there's also this interpretation where many are also concerned with the Jewish Christians in the first century upholding their Jewish traditions, because yes, eventually those will be, let's say, less relevant, but until Jesus comes back, they will be relevant. So we have to await his return, and we should most of all not have too much chaos in the meantime. So there's also this sense of that, and that Paul was like, no, we have to prepare for that now, like it has already come, like realize this has already happened, etc. And yes, I mean, he also speaks of, let's say, the return of Christ, but still I think Paul's really emphasizing like this is already happening, we should stop. And in that sense I like Paul again, that he's not like, okay, like sit back and wait for the return, which indeed also James also doesn't really talk about, but really actively renew yourselves through this insight. So I also kind of appreciate and respect the fact that he brings it up again and again, because I understand that it is just simply a radical message. And everyone agrees that the sentence, there's neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, master nor slave, etc. Like we are all one in Christ Jesus. Like that's just the radical type of message that all of us agree with today, I think, to a large extent. And if not, then like then probably you're not partaking in this conversation. Like I honestly think that you're partly here because you believe that we can transcend our differences, etc. So I also want to, and this I think what Lucas started off with, why he likes Paul, is like, yeah, like that is a central insight that he has received that, I mean, is not so clear, I guess, from the letter of James, even though I really liked it. So I don't know. Again, I'm still torn. You've given me lots to work with, but I'm still torn.
We have about 7 minutes left, so we could start closing a little bit.
Well,
See.
we haven't looked at the discussion questions at all.
Oh Lord.
Yeah, which is like, but if so, was there anything in the discussion questions before we close off that you were like, oh, you know, that would be relevant? Like for instance, some of them were interesting. Like, have we internalized the lesson that that we are neither slave or free, man or woman, Jew or Greek, or are we still working towards that? Like, is there still inequality for race, gender, and social class?
Yes.
So all of that is interesting. How important are Christian roots, or can a humanist or a Muslim or a Jew following Jesus also be a follower of the way? That's something we discussed before. Yeah, and that indeed the culture wars and social justice movement relating to Tom Holland. So like there's so many interesting things. Like, is it about an individual choice, or is this about something that we ought to partake in socially, and therefore, you know, I guess James a little bit more of the social aspect, and Paul is a little bit more about the individual aspect, because it's about, which is also why Luther, I think, sided with him, because we have to have an individual relationship with Jesus and with God, and not this external law-like relationship. So like I think there's actually many things in the discussion question that we could look at. Or the difference between a sect and a cult. So anyways, those are some things, but maybe we want to finish up because we have to.
Well, I'm just curious what GP has to say. Let's go. Whether it's about the discussion questions, whether it's about insights to take home, or anything on your mind.
Sure. I mean, the discussion questions are great questions, but I just fear that if I start to launch into
That's what I was
talking
thinking.
about one, it'll take too long. So I'm going to forego that for now. And I'll just give a few comments about I guess about my experience just reading these two letters. I mean, I thought it was really interesting, and I thought it was a really great decision to read these two at the same time, because seeing them in dialogue with each other made me read them in a way I've just never read them before, and made them come alive in a way that they've never come alive for me before. And see that there was this really intense debate really in the early church. And also seeing the way they responded to each other in terms of specific things. Like, for instance, I think I've already brought up the idea, both in Paul and in James, that if you don't fulfill the whole law, then you'll sort of be guilty of the whole law. But they take that in very different ways. Paul takes that to mean that the old law has been sort of superseded, I guess. Whereas James takes that to mean that if you don't have mercy, that's what will happen to you. But if you have mercy, then mercy will be shown to you. So those are different interpretations.
And Jesus, right? Like Jesus himself also says in the Gospels, right? That we are all sinners, etc. Like even if you only, I don't know, want to covet another man's wife, etc. Then you, etc. All of that, yeah. But go ahead.
Absolutely, and even within Jewish tradition at the time and subsequently, there's different interpretations of this. And I think that many Christian readers of the New Testament sort of assume that Jews themselves have this view that if you don't follow all the commandments, you're guilty of the whole law, or that you have no way of atoning for your sins. But that's just absolutely not true. So this is a very specific view that Paul has. And then I think another huge one was the different takes they have on Abraham, which we didn't really talk about, but I thought that was really fascinating because they basically quote the same passage of Genesis,
Yeah.
but they interpret it in two very different ways. I won't say totally different ways because maybe they're complementary to a certain extent, but very different ways. Where one is it's just talking about his faith, and the other one it's actually making the opposite argument. It's saying that faith was meaningless without works, which in that case was the actual, well, not the actual sacrifice, but the all but actual sacrifice of Isaac. So I thought that was really cool as well. What else? I think that was pretty much it. I mean, at the end of it, I found that I was in broad agreement with James in a certain sense, as opposed to Paul, but I also felt a lot more sympathy with Paul than I had, and I felt a lot more understanding, I think, of where Paul was coming from. He's not some abstract theologian. He's talking from experience. He's motivated by real mystical experience, real transformation of his life. And so while I still find his personality somewhat annoying in different ways, I have a greater sympathy for him.
Well put.
Yeah, okay, I'll go ahead. Yeah. No, I really think you make a good point, GP. So, pretty much congratulations to Bus for doing this, making those two together. I didn't even think about them as kind of disagreeing with each other when I read them, I guess. But now I see that the two different letters and also the two different characters represent these opposing forces that kind of bring us to a better place. So I appreciate the Jameses of the world and the Pauls, and I'm happy not everyone at the table was Paul, and I'm not happy not everyone at the table was James. It almost seems also a bit like the right balance of things at the time, where there's not too many revolutionaries, but at least the spirit of that radical newness, that renewal, was alive. And so I think it was at that time like a seed. And so yeah, I really appreciate you guys' insights on it, because it made me see what I read and listened to in a whole different way, in a way that it became more alive and more intelligible and coherent within each other. Michael. Sorry, Aaron.
Yeah, I know we're almost at time, so I don't have much to say other than just I really enjoyed this, and I agree with everything that's being said. I think it's a good compliment to read both James and Paul together. I'm listening to a series that the rest is history is doing on or has done on the French Revolution, and there's not a lot of Jameses in the French Revolution, and there's a lot of Pauls, and we all know how that ended up for them, at least in the short run. So I think it's interesting to think about. I appreciate you saying the word revolution, Lucas. I think it's interesting to think about this time as that. I mean, very literally, something new is getting born, and I think the like very interesting and unique dilemma that the early church faced is like how to instantiate the Christian religion without creating a Christian nation that ends up becoming, tyrannical and oppressive, and how to honor God, but also create systems of belief, right? And I see both James and Paul wrestling with that in their own way, and I think we can learn a lot from both of them for our own time.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Thanks, Michael. I agree with you, and though I like to think that Paul was a little bit more moderate than Robespierre, for instance, but that's something we can talk about
Yeah, definitely.
at another time. No, I just do want to sort of re-emphasize that yes, it is a split. Like I think it's both important to realize that these two, let's say, do not harmoniously fit together as like, there's no conflict at all. Which some people tend to do if they want to think of the Bible as, let's say, this dictation of God's word, and therefore that it all fits together harmoniously and there's no tension in it whatsoever, and all of it fits up to one neat doctrine. But at the same time, I also don't want to go as far as saying that they are, entirely incommensurable, like together. That in some sense, I do think that James is, like if he is responding to Paul, then I think that works in terms of the Abraham argument that GP pointed out. But then again, Paul is clearly not talking about this faith without works. I think that is a misreading of Paul too. So in that sense, I think we can also keep some of Paul's position while respecting everything that James says. And then again, it's also just fascinating and beautiful that James is this general message to all the 12 tribes, whereas Paul's is this very specific message to the Galatians. So like all of these are very interesting, relevant things, and I'm sad that we didn't go over the angels and principalities, etc. And there's much more also in this discussion questions, but we'll have many more sessions, so it should be fine. Thank you all.
The poor discussion questions. Thank you guys.
Yeah.
Thank you especially to GP for joining so early. 6:45 a.m. when we started on a Sunday, and really nice to have you as a fourth member today. Hopefully we can repeat that pattern.
Yeah, and we'll try to meet again in
about 2 weeks.
A week or two.
Yeah, about 2 weeks.
Okay.
Thank you guys.
Cool.
Have a good day, night.
Happy New Year, fellas.
Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year.
Yeah.
A merry belated Christmas.
Absolutely.
Yes.
All right, ending the stream. See you guys.
Sounds good.
Bye-bye.
See ya.
All right.
Bye bye.
Why are you still here? Person listening, you can see all my personal information right now. Don't do that. Don't look. Be happy. Happy New Year. Do you see this paradox on my screen? Do you see how far it goes? That's a psychedelic experience, from whence all wisdom comes.